Hello everybody, welcome to the Drydock episode 314. This week the questions are taken from guide 389 on HMS Canada-Almirante Latorre and the Wednesday video on 5 naval engineering failures. So let's see what questions these videos have cooked up for us, shall we? Should be some good ones, as there always are. The Kid from Cleveland asks, I believe in your collab with Venom Geek Media that you consider the Starship Enterprise of the original series period to be the equivalent of a late Age of Sail cruiser. What naval analogies led you to this conclusion, considering that her official class is heavy cruiser and she was conceived in the early 1960s? I always inferred that she was the equivalent of an early guided missile cruiser refitted from the surviving World War II heavy cruisers. And considering that that's what was sailing around when Roddenberry described his concept to Jeffries, and you also have her shuttlecraft behaving less like ship's boats and more akin to helicopters. Well, I likened NCC-1701 to a couple of different types of ship. Her mission profile is very similar to a late Age of Sail era frigate, and what I was referring to when it came to that is that back in those days, the term cruiser didn't strictly apply to any specific kind of ship. So you could have a frigate that was a cruiser, you could have a ship of the line that was a cruiser, because cruiser was what the ship was doing, not what the ship was. So as far as the late Age of Sail is concerned, NCC-1701 is like that because her mission is long-distance exploration, which, is part of what being a cruiser in the late Age of Sail pretty much entailed. Obviously, there's also patrols of various stations, but we see Enterprise doing that in the original series as well, patrolling the Klingon border and so forth. In terms of her shuttlecraft, though, I think they do behave a lot more like ship's boats. Yes, they fly, which obviously helicopters do, but when you think about ship's helicopters, a ship's helicopter is involved in transport of people, which obviously shuttles are, but also ship's helicopters tend to have either, depending on the type of helicopter and the type of ship, either a primary or secondary attack role as well, usually anti-submarine. Whereas ship's boats, unless you're in really desperate straits and have maybe stuck a cannon on them, generally speaking, aren't used for that. Ship's boats, especially in the Age of Sail and the Ironclad era, would be used primarily for getting people from a ship to the shore or to another ship in locations where the ship itself couldn't access because there wasn't a harbour and the water was too shallow or whatever. And that's pretty much what you see shuttlecraft being used for as well. In, obviously, Enterprise's case, transport to and from a planet. You don't really, at least in the original series, see shuttlecraft or equivalent-sized vessels being used in an attack role or a hunting role for enemy vessels. For example, if the shuttlecraft were going to be more like helicopters, then perhaps in the neutral zone, when they're going after the Romulan bird of prey, you would have seen the shuttlecraft deployed, maybe firing some kind of spatial charge to try and work out where this Romulan bird of prey is, but you don't see that. But as far as where Enterprise, and indeed most of Star Trek, tends to fit, it is slightly odd because, again, in that collaboration I mentioned that whilst the setting as a whole, in terms of mission and distances and communication and so forth, does to a certain degree resemble the Age of Sail in space, you do still have subspace communications, which are a bit like radio and telegraph, and the mission profiles and armament and so forth that you see is actually much closer to the late 1880s, early 1890s, as the Age of Iron gives way to the Age of Steel. And Enterprise herself, at least when you consider the wider lore of Star Trek in the original series era, is more equivalent to an armoured cruiser, in my estimation, and as I said on there, rather than anything else. the battleship role being taken up by things like the Federation-class dreadnought, which, yes, I know is secondary canon, but we were considering it in that wider field of view. Paladian asks, if the purchase had been approved by the Chilean government, would the Almirante Latorre have been of any use in the Pacific campaign, or would it have been a big waste of money? Would it even be ready to participate immediately, or would it have joined too late in the war to do anything apart from shore bombardments? And separately, by the time of World War II, were there any other warships floating around unemployed that could have been purchased by the belligerent nations from neutral countries, or was Almirante a major exception? Theoretically, there were quite a lot of nations with warships that weren't using them all that much. I mean, you've got the other two South American countries involved in the dreadnought arms race, Argentina and Brazil, and various other nations across the globe if you start looking at things like cruisers and destroyers. But fundamentally, you run into the problem of, if those ships are at least halfway operational, then those navies are probably actually using them and are going to be loath to give them up. And if they aren't really using them all that much, then, well, they might still be holding on to them for reasons of national pride, in which case they're still not going to let you have them. But separately to that, if they've been lying around in reserve for 5, 10, 15 years, they're probably not in very good condition, and therefore you probably don't actually want them. Almirante Latorre kind of sits in this little niche of being vaguely operational and also relatively powerful, because, well, the third issue with purchasing other ships from, third-party nations is that quite a lot of them, not all, but a fair number, were also relatively out of date. Now, of course, Latorre was out of date compared to modern fast battleship designs, but there were a fair number of her contemporaries or near contemporaries still kicking around at the lower end of the capital ship scale. Now, in terms of would she have been able to participate immediately, not in the main Pacific campaign itself, because she would have needed a bit of a refit, if for no other reason than to bring her up to US standards and perhaps change out some of her armament to simplify logistics. Being a British-built ship, the US could always have phoned up the UK and gone, hey, which parts did you make for this thing? Do you have any in storage? We need them. So, 6-8 months or so, she probably could have been turned around and put into full active service. But most likely, if she was bought by the US, then either I think she could have been put to use in the Atlantic, actually, in order to free up other US ships that were being used on Atlantic convoy duty, escort, and so forth, whether that be the neutrality patrols or full-on escort afterwards. Because remember, you're not just talking about older ships like Texas, battleships in this case, but you're also talking about a number of cruisers. And of course, the US cruiser force was very rapidly taking something of a beating in the early stages of the Pacific campaign. So if they bought Latorre, they could say, right, well, instead of, say, putting 2 cruisers on escort duty for this convoy, we'll stick Latorre on escort duty, and those 2 cruisers can now go and probably get their bows blown off by long lances in the Pacific. Because fundamentally, unfortunately, Latorre is not fast enough to keep up with the fast carriers, so she would have ended up, if she was used in the Pacific campaign at all, much like the older US ships, probably on shore bombardment duty, maybe a little bit of convoy escort, possibly maybe stuck with some of the escort carrier groups later in the war as a kind of heavy flagship and escort, and heavy anti-aircraft escort if they stuck a bunch of Bofors on her, although that's a little bit more remote because the US did have a bunch of other battleships they could have done that with and didn't. But it's theoretically possible because as a one-off rather than a standard, she would have slightly different operational capabilities. So whether or not you consider that to be a big waste of money, I guess your mileage may vary. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, Had the South American economy not crashed and the dreadnought race continued, assuming that the three countries get more involved in World War I, how would their fleets have impacted the war? Well, assuming that the political alliances or allegiances or leanings of Brazil, Chile, and Argentina are essentially being exacerbated in this scenario in order to get them more directly involved in the First World War. Whilst you potentially could see ships like Riachuelo and Argentine and Chilean responses to that being constructed, you've got to bear in mind two things. Firstly, of course, the Latorre and Cochrane were still under construction and were then forcibly seized. Well, not technically forcibly seized. Compulsory purchased is probably the better word in that particular case, unlike the what would become Agincourt. So Riachuelo for the Brazilians, and as I said, anything that Argentina and Chile order in response, are also still going to be under construction at the start of the First World War. Chile's response probably is going to also be under construction in Britain. Argentina's response to Riachuelo might be under construction in the US, maybe in Germany. But whatever the case, as we see with some of the other ships that were under construction for foreign powers, it's very likely that therefore the main impact is going to be that the Royal Navy, at least for the duration of the war, is going to have at least a couple more fairly big, heavily armed ships, which is good for the Royal Navy, I suppose. Probably bad news for the High Seas Fleet. And as a very broad thing, Brazil was more Allied leaning, so if they're getting more involved, they just get involved a bit earlier. Chile has a strong pro-German contingent, but overall was also Allied leaning, specifically British leaning. So although it might take them a little bit more time and there'd be perhaps a bit more civil disagreement internally, they'd probably also come over to the British and Allied side within a year or two. The Argentinians, on the other hand, like Chile, were officially neutral during World War I. However, Argentinian sympathies, I wouldn't necessarily say they were more pro-German in the First World War, but they were considerably more anti-British for the usual reasons, and therefore that would push them more towards being pro-Central Powers if we were exacerbating everything to force them to pick a side. Now, the interesting thing about that is, of course, that if Argentina at some point relatively early declares itself to be pro-Central Powers, that is going to limit what everybody else is going to be doing, because if Brazil and, to a degree, Chile are pro-Allied, well, now, one, they've got to keep an eye on the Argentine fleet with the Rivadavia and Moreno, and two, it's a fantastic opportunity for the Chileans and the Brazilians to beat up on Argentina, which is, of course, something that they've wanted to do for a while anyway. The interesting second-order effect of that, however, so while it means that these fleets are not going to necessarily impact the war outside of South America, because they're probably going to be fighting each other, the interesting part is that even if Brazil and Chile are just both loosely on the side of let's kick Argentina rather than officially allied, overall it actually gives the Argentinians an advantage at the beginning because the Rivadavias are superior to the Minas Gerais class, and historically, of course, the two Chilean battleships are over in the UK. Latorre obviously serving as Canada and Cochrane being eventually converted into Eagle. So in order to contain Argentina and safeguard the shipping lanes, because obviously from an Allied perspective, letting the Brazilian and Chilean navies beat up on the Argentine navy and thus, well, neutralize Argentina generally and secure the Southern Atlantic from Argentine interference, you may end up with the British agreeing to actually release Latorre and potentially Agincourt, and maybe even continue expedited construction on Cochrane, purely to give the Chilean and Brazilian navies enough firepower to take down the Rivardavias and the Argentine navy. The compensation for the loss of those ships from the Royal Navy battle line would be, in theory, that they could expedite the completion of Riachuelo and the Chilean Riachuelo response. So net, they don't actually lose out on any hulls, and they end up actually with more capable hulls. And that would probably work out overall to the Royal Navy's advantage, because they get the more powerful ships. It's not like they're immediately short of ships, although 1914 would be the closest the High Seas Fleet ever got to parity during the war. And from the Brazilian and Chilean perspectives, they get their ships ASAP, hopefully before the Argentinians can get their act together and strike heavily against one or the other or both. The Bald Parakeet asks, was there indeed an actual Vickers 14-inch salesman? I'm aware it's a joke, but there's often a bit of truth to them. There wasn't a Vickers 14-inch salesman, as in, this is Mr. Jennings of 64 Bayleaf Gardens. He is the Vickers 14-inch salesman. Can he stand up, please? Cookie, if you get the reference. But the Vickers was very aggressive through multiple salesmen and its general company policy as a whole in trying to push its 14-inch gun. And that's essentially for two reasons. The first being that Vickers was in absolutely sort of lethal competition with Armstrong. Now, they would of course become Vickers Armstrong in the interwar period, but at the time, World War I and the run-up to it, Vickers and Armstrong were two extremely antagonistic competitors in some respects. Armstrong had Elzic Ordnance Company as their gun manufacturing and armament subsidiary, so EOC guns and Vickers guns competed for both foreign contracts and, of course, the incredibly lucrative Royal Navy contracts, because if you manage to get your gun in as the standard armament for at least several classes of British battleship or battlecruiser, that was a lot of orders, both initially and then, of course, later on for reconditioning and support. And at the time, Vickers had thought it had the upper hand, because you had Vickers and Elzic, i.e. Armstrong, competing in the 12-inch field, and Vickers had been the lead contractor on the development of a larger weapon, which of course turned out to be the 13.5-inch gun, but Vickers had done a lot of work on 13, 13.5 and 14-inch weapons. And you can perhaps see where this is going. So whilst the Admiralty had selected the 13.5-inch as the follow-on armament after the failure of the 12-inch 50, Vickers had a fair body of work invested in the 14-inch gun, which they then continued with as a private venture. There was a competing Elzic 14-inch gun, but having put a fair bit of money into it, Vickers were quite desperate to recoup their investment, and because it was obviously a slightly more powerful gun than the 13.5, it was felt it might have a bit of a competitive advantage, but with the dual pushing factors of investment made privately by the company and a direct competitor, Vickers got pretty pushy about trying to include its gun in new designs to essentially justify the cost and get one up on Elzic. And you can kind of see this, as I mentioned in previous questions on the channel, when you look at Vickers designs. Although an awful lot of designs put forward by Vickers at the time are 12-inch or 13.5-inch armed, which is obviously attractive to foreign customers because it offers commonality with the Royal Navy and thus reduced costs. And they do put out the occasional design that's armed with considerably larger weapons, like 15 or 16-inch guns, particularly a little bit later down the line. During the late 1900s and early 1910s period, you'll find that an awful lot of designs that Vickers submits are either just armed with the 14-inch gun apropos of not very much, or they submit a design in the caliber that the foreign customer has requested, but also an alternate version that happens to be carrying the 14-inch gun. and their salesman could be quite pushy if the government in question was a little bit on the fence about which one they wanted to choose, and they nudge, push, wink, wink to try and get them to get the 14-inch in place. And of course, perhaps one of the most notable examples of that would be the Congo class. Now, there's a whole list of reasons why the Congos ended up with 14-inch armament. Partially, obviously, the latest Royal Navy battlecruisers had 13.5-inch armament, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the Congos started off as a 12-inch design and then were very quickly and radically changed from 10 12-inch guns to 8 14-inch guns. Of course, 8 14-inch Vickers guns. And while the Japanese were to a certain extent looking at maybe trying to find a heavier armament for their ships, Vickers, when you look at the records, were, shall we say, quite proactive in arranging for Japanese naval officers to both become aware of and then attend the trials of the Vickers 14-inch gun, which of course they ultimately put on the ships. BK Zhong asks, what is the worst warship concept you can think of? Not in the sense that the design is bad, but in the sense that the ship's intended purpose makes no sense whatsoever. Well, it's a concept, I had to think quite hard about this question actually, but I think the concept would be the one that Admiral Beatty came up with for HMS Eagle, which ironically enough, and completely unplanned by me, is also going to be the subject of the last question in this dry dock, but essentially kind of setting up, I guess, that question as well. The idea of an aircraft carrier that is also extremely heavily armed with torpedo launchers. Now, fortunately, saner heads prevailed, and the concept was put on ice, and Eagle was finished as an actually useful carrier. But the concept really is literally nonsensical, because you're talking about a ship that's supposed to operate aircraft during the day. Okay, we acknowledge it's 1918, 1919. You're not really going to be expecting to operate aircraft at night. But equally, you have no radar, and you won't for a couple of decades. And Beatty's idea was, well, we can have Eagle be a useful fighting ship at night by sticking dozens of torpedo launchers on her, and then she can go forward and attack enemy cruiser squadrons. The idea was for her to get in amongst the enemy cruiser squadrons and wipe them out with torpedo salvos. And I'm sitting there going, okay, well, hang on a minute. You've taken off a bunch of armor from this very large hull to lighten it because you didn't think you were going to need it, and to make it into an aircraft carrier. Also, Eagle is nowhere near as fast as cruiser squadrons of the late 1910s and early 1920s, so how is she supposed to catch any of them? Also, Eagle is very large, so if there's anything that's going to be spotted coming at night before she spots her prey, it's going to be her. And of course, being a carrier, Eagle will have a fair bit of flammability in her upper works. And so going up against cruiser squadrons that are going to see her coming first and are armed with rapid-firing 6 and possibly 8-inch guns and their own torpedoes when she is slower and less agile than them. Why? Who thought this was a good idea? I mean, the idea perhaps of a mass torpedo-carrying slayer of cruiser squadrons in and of itself isn't a terrible idea, but putting them on a big, slow target like Eagle, relative to cruiser speeds, is possibly one of the most nonsensical concepts I've ever heard of. Nitsu asks, opposite of the previous question, what innovation was the biggest leap forward for warships? That's a very close field. I mean, you could argue the cannon for introducing long-range artillery to what had previously been essentially fight small land battles except with an additional risk of drowning. You could also make a very strong case for the steam engine in moving ships from being reliant on the wind and dependent on it to being able to move independently of it, which opens up tactics and so forth. But Personally, I think if you're going to point to the single biggest innovation, I would actually say it was the use of iron in ship construction. Because initially, before you went for full iron ships, it allowed you to have larger wooden ships than you could with just pure wood construction by use of iron strapping. And then once you went into iron-hulled warships like Black Prince and Warrior, Black Prince seen here, that's when I think things really get going, because wooden warships by the 1850s had pretty much reached the reasonable structural limits of what you could do with wood, even with a little bit of iron assistance. But suddenly the use of metal, specifically iron, in construction allowed warships to balloon in size and displacement, therefore carry much bigger and heavier guns incredibly quickly. Now, of course, the use of iron also meant you could have armor, but just the sheer size increase that would be possible even if you just had 1-inch iron hull plating with wood backing would still be an absolute game changer. Plus, of course, the durability and, as we said, the ability to carry much heavier loads and so forth that would be achieved by iron-hulled vessels, obviously particularly ironclads. I would say personally that's the single largest innovation of the history of building warships. Commander Tomalak asks, what gave an Age of Sail ship good sailing qualities? There's a whole list of things that will give an Age of Sail ship good or bad sailing qualities, but if we, for the purposes of this particular question, exclude external factors that could change on a day-by-day basis, such as marine growth accretion on the hull, which would slow a ship down, and which could be solved by various things, primarily in the Age of Sail, obviously copper sheathing towards the latter part of the Age of Sail. If we look just purely at the ship design elements themselves, it's not just a question that still has a very long list of responses, but also it depends what you're defining as good sailing qualities, because, for example, the length to beam ratio is quite important, but if you are looking for a ship is going to go at a very high speed, then you want a ship with proportionally a somewhat greater length to beam ratio, because that will tend to give you a higher speed for various reasons, which probably need their own video to explain in full. And so that's why, for example, French 80-gun ships of the line tended to be faster on average than British 74-gun ships of the line. But in the Age of Sail, having too long a length to beam ratio might not actually be considered good for your sailing qualities, because as your ship gets longer proportional to its beam, it generally also becomes more difficult to steer. It wants to go in a straight direction, and if you try and turn, it may take longer for you to make that turn. And of course, especially in kind of pell-mell Nelsonian style battle, if you are less agile than your opponent, you could be outmaneuvered. So at that point, having a shorter length to beam ratio might be considered to be good sailing qualities, because it makes your ship more agile and therefore better in combat. But then again, the longer one might carry more guns. So you see how there's this trade-off of, do you want an agile ship that can potentially maneuver itself into a position of advantage, or do you want a faster ship that can potentially choose whether or not to actually have that fight and maybe carries a few more guns into the fight, but runs the risk of finding itself being raked a bit more often? And where on the scale of those two things you sit will determine on which design element you think makes the ship a better sailor. And that's before we get into the stresses on the hull and how long the ship can stay out at sea because of hogging and sagging and so forth. The underwater hull form will also affect the ship's speed and agility. Obviously, the more full-bodied it is, perhaps the more stable it is, the more race-like it is, the faster it is, and then you run into not only the issues we've mentioned before, but also how likely is the ship to roll heavily, what's its rolling period, how does this affect your gunnery, pretty much like you'd have even in World War II. Do you want a ship to roll sharply but mostly stay quite flat, except in rough seas, but then be very violent when the seas do get roughed? Or do you want a ship that rolls quite a bit but rolls more slowly and perhaps more predictably? Somewhat more uniformly, though, you have the trim of a ship, so where the ballast is and where all the other loads in the ship are, because a ship that is otherwise a superb sailing vessel may be completely ruined by being trimmed wrongly, perhaps too heavily down by the bow or similar, and likewise a ship that's an indifferent sailor could potentially be substantially improved by shifting its ballast around a little bit here and there. Then, of course, you've got the sails and the rigging and the masts. How many sails have you got? Are you able to hoist 3 or 4 sails on any given mast? And if masts on 2 different ships are of similar sizes, you may run into issues where perhaps having 3 larger sails is better than having 4 slightly smaller ones, and situations that are vice versa. How many additional sails to that can you hoist? So in this picture, obviously, you can see you've got not just the courses and tops, which are the main sails, the ones that are directly in front of each mast, but you've also got studding sails deployed out on either side. So the yard arms have been a little bit extended, and you've got these extra ones which are allowing you additional propulsion, but you've got to have a rigging and mast system that's capable of withstanding the additional force. But of course, that's a heavier system, so what's the trade-off? And the locations of the masts can also be fairly important, because of course the force provided by the wind is being transmitted to the hull of the ship and thus propelling it through the water at various points along the hull, depending on where those masts are. So you don't necessarily want the mast too far forward or too far back, but you also don't want them clustered too close together, because otherwise one set of sails might steal the wind from another. And that's just a few items. And all of these, as you might have gathered by this point, are a degree of balances. So if you want a ship that's configured for a very particular type of operation, you would have a very different setup from another type. So if, say, you wanted a fast blockade runner, you could set the sails and your hull design and so forth in a very particular way, and that would be a good sailor for its duties as a blockade runner. But exactly the same setup may make a terrible long-distance patrol frigate. And even in the realms of a similar ship type, like, say, a heavy frigate, a ship with a more traditional frigate sail setup, perhaps a slightly enhanced, like, say, one of the big American 24-pounder frigates, is better in light airs, but the much heavier sail rig of a Razé, taken from a ship of the line, is better in stronger winds, in part thanks to the heavier build of the hull as well. Juku asks, as a Hungarian, I've been curious for a while, if the Austro-Hungarian Empire had not done the sensible thing and collapsed, do you think it would have had any naval presence further throughout the first half of the 20th century? It's possible, but what form it would take would depend very much on what happened in the interwar period. When you look at the tail end of the First World War, you can see that the Allies were pretty much going for a similar system to what they were going for with the German Navy, which was to essentially take pretty much all the modern stuff away from Austria-Hungary and distribute it to other people and leave it with a rump of a navy. And if the Austro-Hungarian Empire had continued to exist, probably would have had a Versailles-like restriction imposed on it that meant it could have a fleet, but that fleet would be limited in size, and the individual ships would also be limited in their displacement, such that they couldn't be peer competitors with, say, somewhere like Italy, which is, of course, the nation amongst the Allies that would have the most interest in limiting future Austro-Hungarian naval expeditions. Then, of course, you have the fact that the Austro-Hungarian Empire, if by some magic it is being held together politically, is probably going to be in a fair amount of trouble financially. And so perhaps, unlike Germany, they would probably be more content with going along with the Versailles-type restrictions for quite a while, because, well, they couldn't really afford to do anything else. So why bother pushing the boundaries of something they can't afford? Now, the interesting question, of course, is that if you get to the 1930s, where does the Austro-Hungarian Empire sit politically? Because obviously, historically, you got the Anschluss with Austria, and Hungary allied itself with Germany. So you could infer from that that the Austro-Hungarian Empire, while they may not Anschluss with Germany, they would probably have a fairly close alliance with Germany, and that in turn could lead to them starting to construct warships again. Now, the very interesting thing is that, back when you had the Central Powers in World War One, Italy and Austria-Hungary were pretty much building against each other, although notionally they were on the same side. In this case, of course, you would have Mussolini's Italy and theoretically an Austro-Hungarian Empire that is at least allied with Nazi Germany, again, notionally on the same side, but probably staring daggers at each other across the Adriatic. But I have a feeling that because this theoretical Austro-Hungarian Empire would probably have far closer ties to Germany than Italy, they may receive some assistance from Germany, or of course they might be outright controlled by Germany, because it gives Germany access to more shipyards, which is useful, and also gives them direct access to the Mediterranean. Now, initially, in the mid to late part of the 1930s, they may be looking at that and thinking in terms of being able to build up the Kriegsmarine in more yards and the ships being built and sailing out and around Europe to join up with the main Kriegsmarine up in Germany. But as time goes on, they may also be thinking about allowing a either Kriegsmarine or Kaiserliche und Königliche Kriegsmarine presence in the Mediterranean independent of the Regia Marina, and thus more and more ships may start to stay in the Adriatic, which of course would cause more headaches for the Allies, because now you're not just dealing with the Regia Marina, you're also dealing potentially with locally built ships, or maybe even Kriegsmarine elements that are now operating in the Mediterranean and with a home port. Irascibility asks, a while ago I made a joke about HMS Hector of 1862 serving as a fourth-class estuary defence vessel in 1910 based on the Navy's unwillingness to scrap clearly obsolete old tubs. If we assume Jackie Fisher never became First Sea Lord, what would have happened to the miser's hoard of useless junk that he ordered scrapped or placed into reserve? Would they, God forbid, have been pushed into service in World War I, and if so, where? Well, the first thing that came to mind was that they probably would eventually have been disposed of in dribs and drabs as whatever version of the dreadnought race eventually began to occur, because the Navy would be looking to save as much money as possible from every other field to funnel into building new battleships and freeing up crews. The second thing that occurred to me was that even if this didn't take place and they still were sitting around in the optimistic reserves, when the First World War actually kicks off, they probably still would not be particularly heavily used because, well, even the older pre-dreadnoughts like the Majestics and so forth didn't spend massively long in service because of manpower limitations. Even once you've called up the full Royal Navy Reserve and Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, the Royal Navy was spread a bit thin manpower-wise in 1914 and 1915. But if we hand-wave some of those concerns aside and assume that, well, because the ships are still on the books, therefore the Royal Navy has to maintain a slightly higher number of regular men, and therefore obviously the R&R and the R&V are also slightly larger, and the ships are then therefore able to be crewed in World War I, that made me come to a realization that actually set me off laughing for a good 5 minutes. Miss Drac had to come up and find out what was going on. So yeah, realistically speaking, these ships probably would have been scrapped in the late 1900s, early 1910s, or at the very worst probably just sat around on buoys acting as accommodation ships or something. But there is a non-zero chance that they might find a second life, some of them half a century or more after being constructed, as convoy escorts. Because if you think about it, yes, okay, Warrior being a third-class armoured cruiser was being exceptionally generous even in the early 1900s, but the old and obsolete ranges from Warrior all the way up to the late-era ironclads like Sansparai, as you can see here, and then past even Sansparai forward to things like the Royal Sovereigns. They're not particularly quick, but they do carry a very heavy armour protection. Now, yes, this armour protection is not going to be adequate against modern weapons in peer-to-peer combat, i.e. battleship versus battleship combat, but the raiders that Germany has out there, this being Imperial Germany of course, are not equipped with modern battleship-grade weapons. Most of them are equipped with small caliber, quick-firing guns, the biggest of which are 6-inch or 5.9-inch weapons, and a lot of them considerably smaller, 4.1-inch and so forth. And a lot of those are not even the most modern iterations that could be found in the High Seas Fleet. Quite a lot of them are older variants found on, random patrol ships and so forth that happen to be caught out at sea. Now, of course, yes, there is things like von Spee's East Asia Squadron, but that's more the exception than the rule. And, okay, maybe Warrior with 4.5 inches of iron is still vulnerable to a good portion of those shells, but Sansparai, Inflexible, Monarch, these ships, their citadels can probably withstand such shells. And the fact that they can only really sail in, 12, 14, 16 knots doesn't make much odds if you're in a convoy with an average speed of 8 to 10 knots. And a lot of them, okay, Sansparai maybe not so much because it's got big turreted guns, but an awful lot of them, broadside ironclads, central battery ironclads, and even the secondary batteries of ships like Sansparai, they can have their very obsolete guns replaced. Indeed, a lot of them had their more obsolete guns replaced in previous eras. So, dredging up a bunch of 1900s era 4-inch and 4.7-inch and 6-inch guns to refit them so that they have at least equal firepower gun for gun, and probably superior firepower due to numbers of guns, compared to the most likely German commerce raiders, suddenly they actually make a very, very twisted amount of sense. Because if you put one of these things as an escort for a convoy, then, well, they're pretty much immune to German surface raiders. They will also be pretty much immune to U-boats trying to surface and use their deck guns. So, at that point, you've got a certain degree of protection even there. Now, of course, they will be hideously vulnerable to U-boat torpedoes, but considering how few torpedoes World War I U-boats carry, while, yes, some may choose to engage the escort and give it a good go at sinking it, I suspect a large number of U-boat captains would probably prefer to just try and outmaneuver them, because they would prefer to expend their limited torpedo stocks on sinking merchant ships, which actually might affect the overall strategic balance of things, rather than some ironclad older than some of their fathers. And ultimately, a good chunk of these are built with ram bows, so if a periscope is spotted, you may have the absolute hilarity of the cutting-edge weapon of the 1910s being run down by the cutting-edge weapon of the 1870s, which would be greatly amusing. But yeah, it could have happened. John McDonough asks, I've just finished reading Nathaniel Philbrick's book Last Stand about the military campaign against the Sioux and Cheyenne in 1876. One of the more interesting facets of the story was the naval support the campaign had from a contracted steam-powered Missouri riverboat called the Far West. I won't go into details, but it was a remarkable vessel which spent much of the time ricocheting off of riverbanks or literally crawling over sandbars and shoals, going to and from places no one except its captain thought possible. My question is, what did the equivalent Russian, Chinese, British, Brazilian, etc., boats look like? I'm assuming anyone with vast land areas and immense river systems or colonies that had such would need something similar. Am I right? Yes, to a certain extent. The nations that either had extensive river systems or which perhaps had colonized nations with extensive river systems tended to go in, at least in the late 19th century, for quite a wide range of riverine craft. Sometimes, if the area was relatively calm most of the time, it would be a bit ad hoc. Other times, if there was regular descent or a need to patrol actively for other reasons, there would be a purpose-built craft. So sometimes it would just be, like with the Far West, some local shallow draft craft that went, right, you're hired and we're sticking some guns on you. But in terms of purpose-built vessels, you could have just general gunboats, small craft that were technically ocean-going, brought up rivers, particularly obviously in deeper rivers like something like the Nile. The British, for example, made quite extensive use of a wide range of gunboats that they'd actually built for the Crimean War, and then the ones that hadn't rotted, would they be pulled out of the sheds when they were needed. There were also river monitors, so the Hungarians and then Austro-Hungarians built a wide range of river monitors, obviously very shallow draft vessels that could be used on the Danube. And because of their relatively small size, the other thing that could quite often happen would be that if a campaign arose or a general patrol need arose, you would initially use commandeered or purchased local craft, but if the situation escalated or continued for a while, as in more than a year or two, it was actually possible to purpose build shallow draft river gunboats either at home if you were a colonial power, or just upriver if it was your own territory, and send them essentially flat pack to their destination, pop them together pretty quickly, and sail on up the river. And then there was a halfway house between the river gunboat, which was unarmoured, shallow draft, and just heavily armed, and a river monitor, which is, of course, very heavily armoured, in that there were a few armoured river gunboats also developed. But then, obviously, once the crisis was over, those ships would tend to be sold off to local bidders, etc., as no longer necessary. Brian Stevens asks, in your interview with Brett Devereaux on the First Punic War, you talked about how it was relatively cheap to build a new batch of ships as opposed to keeping them operating, unlike the massive capital expenditures that we're used to in the Age of Sail forward. When did this switch over to the cost to build being closer to the cost to run happen? Approximately speaking, it's going to be at a point when the size of a warship, and therefore also technically speaking its utility, but more on that later, starts to grow and the number of crew starts to decrease. So if you like, your manpower per ton ratio starts to drop, which is pretty much going to be commensurate with when did navies start to use primarily sail-powered vessels as opposed to vessels with very extensive rowing provision. And of course that is going to vary quite considerably, because whilst the presence of galleys and galleasses in, say, Northern European waters was a thing right through into the 16th century, and in the Baltic actually resurged several times thereafter, the primary warships in Northern European and Atlantic waters for much of the medieval period were mostly sail-powered, and if they had rowing capability, it was very much auxiliary, whereas in the Mediterranean, the use of primarily rowing or substantially rowing-powered vessels, primarily galleys, continued for quite a bit longer as the most common combatant. And the reason I draw that distinction is that, generally speaking, sailing warships tended to be a little bit larger than rowed vessels because there's a finite number of people that you can normally get on a rowing vessel, and of course rowing vessels have to be fairly long and thin to support the banks of rowers like this trireme, whereas sailing vessels can be a little bit stouter and have obviously very different hull forms. But the main thing is that as larger ships, they're going to be more expensive to build, they have a greater internal volume, and they're going to take longer to build. And their operating costs per unit volume are therefore going to be less, because if they don't have 100 plus rowers aboard, if you've got a crew that's maybe 20 or 30 strong, it costs you less to operate. Now, depending on which state you're talking about and what time period, you may not be paying the rowers all that much, but you still do have to provide them with food and water and all of that kind of stuff. And then we look back to the utility perspective, because something like a trireme, relatively speaking lightly built, relatively speaking small, and relatively speaking expensive to operate, also is not particularly useful in, if you like, the off-season. If there isn't a war or it's winter time, there's not an awful lot that can be done with them. And so at that point, essentially disbanding them, letting them rot away, just recover the big bronze ram and then recall people back again and quickly build a new fleet makes more sense when you need it. Whereas if you've got big ships, you've spent a lot more money on them in the first place, they'll take a lot longer to build, so if a war breaks out, you may not have the time to build up a fleet, and they have a much lower ongoing running cost, and because they tend to be somewhat more stoutly built than a trireme, for example, they'll probably do relatively well in maintenance, so you can have them sitting in harbour for several years, and as long as a minimal amount of care is taken with them, they're probably not going to rot away at quite the rate that a trireme would. And there's a secondary factor, which is, of course, as we said, a trireme is not really good for much other than warfare or other warlike duties, whereas, say, a medieval cog, it might be a royal ship, but when the king doesn't need it, if it's not just going to be tied up, you can haul cargo with it and make money, or lease it to someone who will do that. And so essentially I think you're overall probably looking at, when do large sailing ships with a much smaller crew to size of ship ratio start to become the predominant ships of a navy? That's when the ships, generally speaking, are going to become cheaper to build and then maintain than they are going to be build, allow to fall apart when you don't immediately need them, and then rebuild again later on. J. Mace asks, I have seen pictures and videos of stairways mounted on warships that are at anchor, but for obvious reasons they're not mounted when the ships are sailing. Were these stairs stored on the ships when not in use, or somewhere in the harbour, and what was the process for mounting and unmounting them? Some of the more substantial stairways and gangways may well be stored in harbour and brought to the ship, but if you're looking at stairways pretty much like the one you can see here, these are known as accommodation ladders, and they're actually collapsible, and they're stored aboard ships. Now, they may be stored on deck, or they may be stored adjacent to or on part of the ship's superstructure, depending on how much superstructure the ship has and where they're positioned. But relatively often on a warship, you might find them literally just folded up and over on the deck itself. They have to have a special davit, which is the overarm crane-like unit, which is also used in other instances to support ships' boats. Because what will happen is they'll be unfolded, lowered over the side, and if they're completely portable, they may be obviously dismounted from somewhere else on the ship's superstructure, taken over to their mounting point, then mounted to the ship, and then flipped over and the thing lowered. But as you can see here, in this case, there is the special davit just from our perspective in front of one of the main funnels. And that allows you to control the descent of the accommodation ladder down the side of the ship. And then, of course, you can also determine where the base of it is going to be, because you may need to adjust that depending on the kind of craft that's coming alongside and also how deep the ship is sitting in the water. And of course, whether they are just stored flat on deck, pretty much where they're needed, and then, as I say, just flipped over 180 degrees and lowered by the davit, or whether they are capable of being taken off and stored elsewhere on the ship, depends partly on how high they have to go. So if you're talking about ones perhaps on the stern of a ship that's not a flush decker, then obviously those will be shorter, therefore they're going to mass less. What they're made of may also affect things, but also how wide they are. So an accommodation ladder off the quarterdeck that only needs to support one person, it's only one person wide, that might be relatively easy to be moved about and stored elsewhere when it's not in use, whereas perhaps something like this, which as you can see has to be 2 decks high when unfolded, and probably may be able to accommodate 2 people coming up at once, maybe 1. It's not clear from this because obviously we're looking at it from the side. That may be a more substantial unit that probably is going to be harder to move around the ship. It may still be moved around the ship for storage, but it's coming into the more likely region of being stored close by to or exactly where it is needed, just as I folded it up on deck. The one-man Kiyoshi Kikawa fan club asks, during the Pacific War, technology for encrypting voice communications over radio quite simply did not exist, but the language barrier and short-range nature of such transmissions made it difficult to interpret captured communications in a timely manner. Did the US Navy ever use Japanese Americans to get past this language barrier, or was this considered too much of a security risk? Now, granted, this is a part of naval history which I don't know all that much about, but as far as I am aware, the US Navy didn't make regular use of Japanese Americans to essentially stand on the bridge and go, okay, hey, this this short-range Japanese radio communication we picked up said this. What did he say? Apart from anything, quite frankly, how close you'd have to be to actually intelligibly pick up enemy radio voice communications in a naval context would be so close that you wouldn't really care what they were saying. You'd be more involved in the shooting them at point-blank range element of what was going on. Now, that's not to say the US Armed Forces generally didn't make use of Japanese Americans and their language skills in terms of intercepting and decoding enemy communications, either by direct translation or whatever. But, as far as I am aware, this was mostly done via the army, where, of course, you might be a few hundred yards away, hiding in a quickly dug trench, and at that point knowing what the enemy is saying over their voice radio, 500 yards or a kilometre away, mile away, whatever, might then actually be very useful and actionable intelligence, hence the picture that's on screen at the moment. But, as I said, it's not an area I know all that much about, so if anyone has done any particular studies into it and knows of any US Navy, Japanese American sailors, and particularly any of their use in decoding and messaging, etc., outside of the military intelligence service pictured here, then please obviously chime in below. Alex Moskovitz asks, you've previously mentioned your nominations for which ships and when made the best and most accurate shots. What are candidates for the worst shots? Who missed shots that really shouldn't have been able to miss? Well, there's a lot of potential candidates for this. I mean, one of the shots I probably mentioned in terms of accuracy probably qualifies as both accurate and inaccurate, that being the Queen Elizabeth's at the Battle of Jutland in the run to the south. As I've mentioned before, the Germans in First Scouting Group actually reported that a good number of their salvos were close enough that they should have hit, but spoiler alert, they didn't hit. I mean, obviously they did hit with some, but a good number of salvos that the Germans thought would have hit them didn't, because the groupings were actually overly tight. They're actually too accurate in their groupings, whereas a slightly wider grouping, more commonly found in naval guns, probably at least 1 or 2 of shells in those particular salvos would have found their mark. So that's an example of both being spectacularly accurate in terms of you aimed at this point and you hit very, very, very close to this point, but also inaccurate because that point happened to be 100 or 150 yards away from an enemy warship, which normally you would have hit if your guns weren't quite so good at hitting where you aimed, as opposed to just in the general area. You could also argue perhaps Pomone at the conclusion of the engagement with HMS President. Again, as mentioned in that video on that battle, she fired a full broadside at fairly close range at President and managed to score a single hit, which is not very impressive considering that President, whilst limping away, was not exactly taking particularly evasive action or indeed firing back at that stage. You then, of course, have Italian battleships in some engagements where, again, as mentioned in previous points, you have a situation of their range finding is absolutely superb. They're dropping shells right on the target, so by all accounts, if they just fire enough shells, they're going to hit something, but all those 15-inch salvos end up doing is blowing up unfortunate Mediterranean fish populations, because unlike, in fact, the direct opposite of the QEs at Jutland, whilst in both cases the range finding is pretty darn good, in the QE's case the spread was far too narrow. In the Latorre's case, at times the spread was far, far too wide. And finally for this week, Todd Webb asks, back before carriers were taken seriously, was there any thought given or designs drawn up for putting torpedo battleship type numbers of torpedo tubes on a carrier to go with surface guns? Well, as mentioned earlier, there was BT's idea of fitting ridiculous numbers of torpedo launchers to Eagle, but, as said in the previous question, unfortunately this seems to have died a death pretty quickly. The weird thing is that Eagle would have been one of the least suitable ships to be so fitted. I mean, along with Hermes, Hosho and Langley, she's far too slow to be used as a giant torpedo attack craft compared to the target she'd be going up against. You know, as said previously, she's nowhere near fast enough to actually go after cruiser squadrons, which was BT's supposed intended target. And even though she's a little bit faster than the average battle line, nowhere near fast enough, really, to be going off acting independently at night. The obviously slightly odd thing about it is that Courageous, Glorious, Lexington, Saratoga, Akagi, and to a certain extent Kaga, at least in the 1920s, were fast enough, especially with Lexington and Saratoga, to, at least from that element of things, potentially go in guns and torpedoes blazing. And again, potentially with Lexington and Saratoga, not only are they fast, but they've also got the biggest guns, those 8-inch mounts. Akagi and Kaga do have 8-inch guns, but not quite as well laid out. So if there was ever any carrier that was going to go charging about dropping torpedoes left, right and centre at night when it couldn't operate its aircraft, it would have been the Lexingtons. But the US Navy was generally of the opinion that the Lexington should stay way the heck away from anything that could potentially fire guns at it, and something that was only really reinforced when they actually got them in service and then did fleet problems with them. So it would seem, at least as far as I can tell, that as far as you can call it a serious proposal, the only serious proposal to fit carriers with ridiculous numbers of torpedo launchers to use them like giant destroyers seems to have come from Beatty, and of course he selected this one of the worst possible ships to actually be equipped there. But are you really surprised? So that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening, and of course just a quick reminder that as of the time of this video going live, I will be departing for the US in a couple of days, so hopefully I'll be seeing some of you at Annapolis, some of you at USS Cod over in Cleveland, Ohio, and some of you over at USS Slater in Albany, New York State. Maybe even some of you in San Diego. In any case, see you then. Bye.